Okay, hello everyone. This is Volts for January 29th, 2025, which I'm still getting used to saying. Chris Hayes on the attention economy. I'm your host, David Roberts. There is little that is more personal to each of us than our attention. Our lives are composed on a moment-to-moment basis by what we choose to pay attention to. What draws our attention creates our world in a very real way. But attention has also become a commodity, and not just any commodity, but the central commodity of the modern economy. The attention economy has eaten the real economy, and now all of us, from the biggest brands to the most obscure social media posters, are in a war of all against all. Everywhere you look, all the time, everyone wants your attention. That makes it pretty tough to use it wisely. That, anyway, is the basic thesis of The Sirens Call, How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource, a new book by longtime MSNBC host and author Chris Hayes, who needs no introduction here. I've known Chris a long time. I've been on his podcast. He's been on Volts before. I'm keenly interested in this subject of commodified attention, and this new book of his really got my brain revving, so I am super excited to talk to him all about it. Seattleites, side note, if you can't get enough of Chris here, catch him live at Seattle's Town Hall next week on February 4th. With no further ado, Chris Hayes, welcome back to Volts.
It's great to be back, Dave.
Great book, man. Cool. Good book. Well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your loss for words. I think that's I'll take that as a good review.
I feel like modern life, whatever you call modern life, the puzzle of modern life, you've grabbed a big chunk of it here, I think. So I'm excited to get into this, but I want to start at the most focused, specific level. Let's just talk for a minute about attention itself before we back out into the social and political stuff. You talk about three kinds of attention. Mm-hmm. Let's just start there. Let's just start with a topology or a typology of what we mean by attention.
Yeah, so I think the most intuitive thing we mean by attention, and William James wrote about this, in the 19th century, is just where we flash the spotlight of thought. Is, if you want to use a metaphor, right? So it's a focusing mechanism, where there's a spotlight on a stage, there could be a chorus on the stage, but if the lead of the musical starts to belt out a big number and the spotlight goes on that lead, that's where you focus your attention. And we can do that with our own thoughts. You can be in a room right now as I'm talking to you, and this is actually a useful exercise at any moment. There are so many things I could be paying attention to in this room. There's so many places that I could put my attention, but I'm focusing them on you. And that's an exercise of my will and my conscious thought.
Right. Volitional, on purpose.
Volitional and on purpose. It's voluntary in the sense that I'm choosing to do it. So that's the main thing we tend to think of in attention, right? Like, where do I put my thought? Where do I put my focus? Then there's this other component to it that is really important to grasp, which is involuntary attention. And because attention is a faculty that evolved for very clear evolutionary reasons, right? I mean, if you are, around the campfire and you're listening to a story of the hunt and then a big predator comes through the bushes and you hear the twig snapping, right? There's some aspect of attention that has to be essentially compelled or involuntary, right? Where some part of your consciousness snaps to that sound of the predator in the bushes. And we experience this all the time. When a siren wails down the street, when an infant cries on a flight, if someone's being disorderly in a public space or on a subway car, it's not that you volitionally choose to put the spotlight on them. It's that your attention snaps to them before you get a conscious say.
Right. You can't help it.
You can't help it, and it happens before you even get to consider it.
Right. And I don't know if this is the best way to describe the division, but it's sort of, I think of voluntary attention as more of a kind of a frontal cortex, higher thought type of thing, whereas the involuntary attention tickles your lizard brain, right? Which is deeper and more fundamental, and therefore, when activated, trumps the higher thought, right? And that's sort of how the brain works.
Absolutely. And we've all, most people I think have had the experience of, say, coming upon deer, right, in a meadow or in the forest, and they're doing their thing, and then they hear something, and their heads snap up, right? That moment of involuntary attention for them, because it's an animal. Animals have it too. They don't have the other one. I don't think the deer could be like, what am I doing with my life? Or I really want to listen to you on a first date. But so those are sort of two sides of the coin. And then the third, which I don't think kind of maps onto the psychology literature, but I think is as important, is what I call social attention. And the short way to think of that is when we are paying attention to other people and when other people are paying attention to us, it has, I think, a kind of difference in kind, a specific set of psychological and philosophical implications that are distinct from paying attention to other things.
Right. And you can almost think of this as a kind of subcategory of involuntary attention. It's so deeply rooted that it's very difficult. Like you in the book, you talk about being at a cocktail party chattering, and you sort of naturally screening out other conversations just sort of automatically. But if in one of those other conversations, someone says, Chris Hayes said blah, 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 like that will reach your lizard brain from across the room.
Yep.
And you'll immediately be like,
And this isn't just a thought experiment. This is actually an experimental finding,
right,
that your own name will penetrate and wrench your attention away. And that's because social attention has this specific force and all these implications for kind of who we are and what we are that are wired deep in us.
Right. I want to come back to social attention in a minute, but what falls out of this typology, I think, is one of the most important insights in the book. One of many things which, when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that's obvious, but like a lot falls out of it, which is simply this. It is easier to grab someone's attention than it is to hold their attention. Involuntary attention has a power and an immediacy that you cannot replicate with voluntary attention. So it's just easier to get attention than it is to hold it. So talk about everything that is implied by that, because sort of like almost like all the rest of your book falls out of that.
Yeah, and I think to illustrate that point, you could go to any single person and say, I'm going to have you walk in this room. There's 500 people in there, and I just need you to get everyone's attention. And basically everyone could do that. I mean, if you walked in and you screamed or you got up in front of the room, you started taking your clothes. I mean, if you had any means available. But if I said, look, there's 500 people in there, I want you to go on the stage and hold them spellbound for an hour. What the hell would you do, right? So what falls out of that is because compelling attention and grabbing it is easier than holding it, the more ferociously competitive a market for attention gets, the more iterative you sort of unleash attention capitalism on people where you're competing second by second, the more you will drive towards the lizard brain, the brainstem, the compelled attention, almost as a kind of unavoidable aspect of the incentives. So what you're going to drive towards is grab.
Yeah. And this is, to me, just an inevitable result. If you want attention, if attention is what's valuable to you, if attention is literally money to you, like everyone who creates content on the internet is very aware of just how difficult it is to hold people's attention. Everyone who's, you've seen metrics, you're, I'm sure, intensely familiar with metrics.
Yep.
And anybody who's ever written a headline versus a story, right? Like the headline is meant to grab attention. The story is meant to hold it. And we know from every metric from the history of the internet, it's real easy to grab people's attention, but they start falling off almost immediately. So what you call this grab model is the slot machine model. So say a little bit about that and why it's so powerfully effective.
Yeah, I mean, this part of the book is taken from a great academic named Natasha Dow-Schull, who wrote this amazing book called Addiction by Design, which is about how machine gambling works in Vegas, the slot machines. And it's about the kind of attentional trance that the games produce in people. And part of the point that she makes about these games, which have basically taken over more and more casino floors because they're the most profitable thing on a casino floor.
God, that is so depressing.
To illustrate the point, right, is that they create this kind of attentional trance where, she'll talk to people that have really intense compulsions, addictions to these games. And they're like, I'm not playing to win. I know I'm losing money. It's the experience of the trance that I'm after.
Right.
And so what we have, and I don't think it's an accident that like the vertical sort of scroll, the flick of the thumb is essentially the same visual element of the casino slot machine.
Yep.
And that we're all just like playing like dopamine slot machines on our phones all day with our thumb.
Yep. And we know from the, psychology science that getting irregular rewards, like
Exactly.
sometimes you get a hit, sometimes you don't, is more addictive than it would be if you reliably got rewards.
Exactly.
Like the sort of element of chance just keeps people coming back. Yeah. So like a slot machine is just like grabs your attention and you hold your attention just long enough to see the flowers rotate and stop, and then it grabs it again and grabs it again and grabs it again. And there's a little, squirt of dopamine each time that happens. But so you put these facts together, just what we've laid out so far. There's voluntary attention, involuntary attention, and particularly sort of powerful kind of involuntary attention called social attention that is now valuable. And we're going to return to why it's so valuable in a minute. But that means if you're in a marketplace that wants your attention, the best way for someone who wants your attention to get it is to grab it over and over again, to shout over and over again.
Particularly the best way to get it at scale. And I think it's useful to think about the way food and hunger work for this because, we have biological inheritances in our appetites, right? Like we're drawn to sugar because it's very calorically packed. We're drawn to fat. Like when the Bible conjures a land of plenty, it's milk, fat, and honey, sugar, right? So if you want to sell food at scale, right? Not like a 30-seat restaurant, but like to billions of people, you drive towards what? Burgers, fries, Coca-Cola, right?
Processed.
All that processed stuff that is lighting up our biological inheritance, and you can sell it anywhere in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that's all people want to eat. And it doesn't mean you can't make a profit selling other stuff. In fact, the amazing thing about humans is they'll eat anything. I mean, it's incredible, like from bugs to caviar to all sorts of plants that you wouldn't think, to flowers and salads. I mean, there's a million things people eat, right? But you've got these side by side. You've got the kind of food as culture and identity and bonding and cuisine, and you've got food as, industrial scale, like demand. And we've got a very similar thing happening with our attention. And that industrial scale demand is going to drive towards that kind of compelled lowest common denominator.
I want to set up this framework because I want to return to it later and I think the food analogy is good and it works in that you say, just take me as an example. In this minute, I want a sugary snack, right? Because a sugary snack squirts this dopamine, feels good, tastes good. So that's one sense in which I want something. But I also, in another sense, want to be healthy and to lose some weight.
Correct.
So which of those do I want? Which is my real want? And what I think we're seeing is in a massive capitalist competition for my food dollar, right? You're going to appeal again and again to my lizard brain immediate instinct want. And what happens in capitalism, and I want to come back to this later too, is we start seeing anything that might serve that second kind of want, that longer term want. Like if you want that longer term thing, by definition, you have to gatekeep the short-term thing, right? Some force, someone, some mechanism, some institution, some practice has to gatekeep what comes in front of you if you want that longer-term health. So what does that? What do we trust to gatekeep our food? And capitalism sort of inherently distrusts and is kind of corrosive to any kind of gatekeeping that serves that second longer-term desire. And that's what you see in attention too, is just like the cheapest, easiest, most short-term version of it just getting shoveled at us. And we mistrust gatekeepers. Anyone who gatekeeped, that information, decided what we should see and what we shouldn't, is just getting eaten away by, I guess, capitalism. I don't even know if that's the right word for it.
And this tension between the different part of ourselves, the self that wants the snack and the self that wants to eat healthy. I mean, the title of the book, like the animating first image, is Odysseus bound to the mast, resisting the Sirens Call, where there's two selves. There's the prior self of Odysseus who wants to make it home to his family. and under the advice of Circe binds himself to the mast so that he won't fall prey to the allure of the sirens. And then there's the self in the moment of Odysseus, who wants to go towards the sirens, is desperately begging his men to steer towards them. And the commitment device there, the gatekeeping that works there, is that he binds himself to the mast.
Right. But
it's because he's at war with different versions of himself in time and different, aspects of his self. And that war just constantly, we've been living that war in our bodies for a long time, if, the amount of like food advice and obesity and exercise, but we're now living that war in our minds second to second.
Yes, it's intentional now. And one thing that's worth pointing out is, even though binding yourself to the mast looks like I'm disciplining myself, right? This is a solo thing. Even that depends, in some sense, on other people.
Yes.
Not untying you when you tell them to, right?
Yes,
So
totally.
it's social. Any gatekeeping, any form of lashing yourself to the mast to resist these short-term pressures is social and requires some social trust of someone. And I want to make the point that I didn't feel like you hit it hard enough in your book. It just could be because I'm angsty about it. But I just want to say that one of the reasons we're talking about all this is that developing any skill or expertise requires sustained voluntary attention. Mm-hmm. That is sort of the nature of it. That's what practice is.
Yes.
So, people talk about losing the ability for sustained voluntary attention. Like, oh, I can't even read a book anymore. But like, it's a bigger deal than that. Like, everything humans are good at or can do or that is worthwhile in human society requires sustained voluntary attention.
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of the implications. And I think, you're seeing that manifest in the world. You're particularly seeing this, I don't want to take us off on a tangent, but I think you're seeing it there's some evidence that there's some gender differences. Whether the source of that is something biological, so I'm skeptical of, and more likely the sort of way that, boys and girls are acculturated.
Yeah.
And, you're seeing this in like higher education pursuits and like all kinds of things that, require this sort of sustained voluntary attention, that boys are doing worse at it. And I think there's a connection between those.
So you think, at least in current society, for whatever reason, women are acculturated, are better able to offer their sustained voluntary attention?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. I mean, I think it's actually a huge source of a lot of what's going on in the sort of increasing gender divide.
That's interesting. I wanted to talk briefly a little bit, just focus on social attention, because I think social attention, much like attention generally, much like food, much like the rest of the analogy, there are kind of junk food forms of it and sustaining forms of it. And one of the things you talk about is that, the quest by these platforms, by these tech companies to get our attention, obviously always anyone who wants to sell us anything wants our attention. Anyone who wants to teach us anything. People have always wanted our attention. But what you have now is the ability to personalize that outreach to attention. This is what the algorithms are. This is the sort of effect of you giving all your information to the gods of online, is that they know you now and can customize their bids for your attention in a way that triggers this social attention. But you talk a good bit about how to be online is just to be subject to social attention and to give social attention. It's kind of what online is now.
That's what online is.
But what you're getting is not the sustaining kind. So you have this phrase, we're stuffed but starved, like stuffed with attention, but starved for what we really want, which is recognition. So explain that difference just a little bit.
Yeah, and first I should give a shout out to Raj Patel, who's the author who wrote a book called Stuffed and Starved, again, about the weird perversity of the global food system. That Stuffed and Starved is, yes, we're getting more attention than we've ever gotten. I mean, up until very recently, the experience of social attention from strangers was something that a tiny fraction of anyone at a given time could ever get. Tiny. I mean, movie stars, politicians, people that achieved some kind of fame, most people were not being subject to social attention of strangers. I mean, let me also say, women, particularly walking through public space, female bodies of all ages, unfortunately, being subjected to social attention, the gaze from strangers has been happening forever. So that is distinct. And obviously half the population experiences that. But I mean, the like specific thing of like, strangers saying like, your idea is stupid.
Yeah, and you'll be old enough to remember that, like, back in the day, there were local newspapers, and occasionally the local newspaper would be like, rando at this random church, like, won a TV in a giveaway. You know what I mean? And it would be such a thrill for that person to be like, my God, I'm in the paper.
I'm in the newspaper.
Like paper people, like people, it's just like the divide was so fundamental, was so distant.
I'm thinking of the scene in The Jerk when Steve Martin's like, the new phone book is here. The new phone book is here. Yeah. Everyone's going to know my name. Until recently, this was a very, very, very tiny fraction of people who are experiencing this, particularly in the way we're experiencing it now. Now it's totally democratized. I mean, social attention from strangers is basically the traffic of the internet. And the point I'm making is that the thing that's so fascinating about attention as a force is that it's both very powerful and also mere. It's sort of always necessary and never sufficient.
Yeah.
You need social attention for all the things you actually want out of human relationships, like love and caring and support and friendship. And
as you point out, like as the human species uniquely needs it to survive. When we're born, we're born helpless.
Yes, and so you need it literally from the moment you come screaming into the world. But it's also not enough. And so what you get in this stuffed and starved dynamic is you're getting a lot of attention, but what you really want is something deeper, which, I say is basically recognition. The philosopher Alexander Koyev says that what human desire fundamentally is at its core is the desire for recognition, to be seen as human by another human. The internet doesn't really give you that, but it gives you this kind of close approximation, this facsimile that makes you feel like you're close to getting recognition and keeps you kind of going for more and more of it, but always coming away not sated.
You talk about this, I think it was Hegel, the sort of master-slave relationship, like the master can get attention from the slave, but it's not sustaining for him because what you really want is recognition from someone you acknowledge as a human being yourself, from a full other human being who you recognize as a human being. And sort of almost definitionally, the people you encounter online are not that. They're simulacra. They're performances, right? They're literally images. They're avatars.
Yes.
So almost by definition, you cannot get what you want and need from those people. And yet, like you say, you can't stop trying.
Right. That's exactly right. Because you can't fully actually recognize them as human.
Right. It's funny. You talk about the sort of disorienting effects of fame, of getting this social attention, which, as you say, like used to be so rare that like the people subject to it weren't even really allowed to talk about it because no one cared, because it would be like a god on Olympus complaining about,
like
no one cared, but it became more and more common. It became more and more of a kind of a standard subject of like the disorienting effects of having all these people pay attention to you. And now you say this is available to more and more and more, like it's going lower and lower. Like you are at a certain level, you're like on TV, so you're recognized to some extent. But, I've even tasted a tiny little shade of it. And it is wild how thoroughly and rapidly it fucks with your brain. I don't think people appreciate. And you and I have seen in the social media age, sort of like randos, just normal random people thrust into the spotlight for one reason or another. And God, people just have the most weird, bizarre flailing.
I mean, they lose their minds.
Yeah, they lose their minds. People are not prepared for it.
I mean, it's like an evil science experiment to produce psychosis.
And as you say now, we're getting attention when we want recognition, but it kind of seems like the constant pursuit of attention now is starting to occlude those activities by which we would get recognition. Do you know what I mean? Because recognition, seeing people as human beings, that takes some time and a little bit of devotion and a little bit of willingness to work through some awkwardness.
And mutual relationships, mutuality. I mean, that's the other key part, right? Like, there's a few reasons that attention's weird, right? Social attention. One is that it's kind of mere, it's necessary but not sufficient. Two is that it doesn't have to be mutual. Like, you can pay a lot of attention to Brad Pitt and not know him, right? It could go in one direction.
Right.
You can't be in a friendship with Brad Pitt and not know him. You can't be in a romance with Brad Pitt and not know him. You can't be in a mentor-mentee. There's no relationship you can be with him, but you can pay him social attention. And then the third aspect that's weird is it can run the gamut from deep love to like hatred to like, someone screaming in your face in the subway is paying you social attention. So like, that's the other thing is there's no valence to it. And in fact, negative attention, I think, is in some ways, negative attention kind of outcompetes positive attention, if that makes sense.
One of the very common phenomena of our time is dudes, not always dudes, but usually dudes, who are so palpably desperate for recognition that they will accept negative attention as a substitute, right? I mean, that is the life of Elon Musk in a nutshell.
I mean, the two most powerful people in the country are,
yes, and Trump.
Trump and Musk, are just, and I think it's born of their personalities, but I also think they have backed into a kind of feral insight. Like, I think trolling, which is the pursuit of negative attention, essentially as an efficient means of getting attention if you don't care about whether it's positive or not, right? So it's like, if all you want is attention, it's probably easier to get negative attention than positive attention.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well established. It's the negative emotions that grab you, right? Outrage, anger, resentment.
And so you've got this kind of trolling model that I think is like before our eyes kind of colonizing all of public discourse. And
yes,
it really is. And I think Musk is important in this because I think Trump is so sui generis. Even I thought, I was a little unclear to me how much he was sui generis. And now you've got this iterative 2.0 version in Musk that makes you recognize like, oh, and I write about Musk in the book a lot, more than I thought I would. And at a certain point I was like, is there too much Musk in this book? And it's like, no, dude, this is the reason he keeps showing up is because he is at the vanguard of this. And so now that you've got Musk, it's like, oh, this is something more than just the weirdness of Trump. We've got another one now, and it's because of what the attentional incentives are.
Yes. And we don't want to get off on psychological diagnosis, but I think a lot of these people are incapable of doing the kind of things that would bring recognition or affirmation. That requires a little bit of mutuality, requires a little bit of seeing out into the world rather than only seeing your own ego. You know what I mean? So like, these guys are never going to get what they want. That's the thing. It's so clear from the outside. They're trying so hard and they're so never going to get what they want. But that is true on some smaller scale for all of us. We're all kind of doing a little bit what Musk is doing, right? That's the horrible thing.
I mean, the comparison I make in the book is Willy Loman in The Death of a Salesman, who says, basically, the opening scene, he comes back from a sales trip and it's like, I'm not there. No one listens to me. And his wife to her sons when lecturing them is like, he's a human being and attention must be paid. That's the line she says. Well, she's not even asking her sons to pay Willy Loman love or the fidelity of sons. And we think of him as like this unbelievably pathetic figure and this tragic figure, but it makes Willy Lomans of us all.
Yes.
I mean, this is here I am. I'm going around. I'm doing a publicity tour for my book.
Yeah.
Like,
and I have a podcast. Like, that's a lot of attention. And yet here I am out every day on friggin' the internet, shouting and yelling in pursuit of I know not what, unable to stop. So one of the other big planks of the book's argument. So you have this stuff about attention and how it works and the different kinds and the reason that this slot machine model has developed just in that grab over and over again is easier than grab and hold. And that's true, especially for social attention as well. But then you also have this other argument, which is that, as I said, everyone's always wanted attention, right? Like the competition for attention is not new, but you think there's something new in the modern economy where basically every other sphere of life is now starting to orient around attention, that the attention economy is eating the real economy. Just sort of make that case briefly.
Yeah, I'll try to make this as quickly as possible. I mean, the first step in the argument is to recognize that this sort of move from the industrial economy to the information economy, which I think is a fairly common thing, right? Like, that a lot of the economic activity now is generated by moving bits and not atoms, right? So if you're if you compare a claims adjuster to a steelworker, right? The claims adjuster is just at a laptop all day. She might be making more than the steelworker, but she's not physically moving the world, right? So we all kind of understand there's this thing called the information age, the digital economy. The key insight here is that the most important resource of the information age isn't information, it's attention.
Right. Information consumes attention. I think that's another one that seems obvious once you read it, but like a lot falls out of that.
Exactly right. And that's from a Herb Simon, brilliant economist and political scientist who wrote this paper, gave this talk about decision-making in organizations under attentional constraints. And the finite thing is attention, not information. Your information's everywhere. I mean, if David Roberts' information is in 10 places or 1,000 places, does it matter that much? You don't even know. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change your life. If your attention is somewhere and not another place, because that's yours and it's finite.
Yes. And information has become trivially cheap.
Yes.
Wildly oversupplied. And it's happened so quickly. Like, I really think, and I think you probably agree with this, I really think a lot of weird generational stuff has to do with the fact that old people today, our sort of oldest generation today, grew up in a world where information was still relatively scarce resource.
Yes.
And that if you had it, you should hoard it. And that and going out and seeking it and finding it was important. And those just mental and physical and political habits formed in that environment are now wildly out of place.
I mean, look at the notifications of any boomer on their phone. I mean, every single one. And the reason is for exactly that reason. Like, it used to be that someone would try to call you at your house and you weren't there and you just missed the call. And, there's entire Seinfeld plots around this. People had, people can tell you stories about missing some key call in their life that had some huge effect. I asked this girl out and then she called me back, but I wasn't there. And then she ended up going out with my friend, something like that. So what does a boomer's phone look like? It's like constant. It's like nothing's muted. It's all notified. I mean, God bless and love the boomers in my life, including my parents, who I love.
It's the same reason they keep their good china, and like every book they've ever had in their life, just like
because it's valuable.
Yeah, they were raised in a time of
information poverty. Yeah,
right. So now information is everywhere, but and this is the key insight of this chapter of the book. It's just that like the flip side of information is attention, and for every bit more information you have, that makes attention more and more valuable because information is infinite and attention isn't.
And that's where you get this kind of supremacy of the brand over the product in the kind of global economy. I thought
that was a really interesting point.
I mean, this is Naomi Klein's thesis of no logo, which is basically like, at a certain point in globalized production, like there's just a bunch of early in the 90s and 2000s, there's just a bunch of factories in Shenzhen.
Yeah, like I don't know which factory in China is good at making shoes versus the one who aren't good at making shoes.
But the swoosh that's Nike, the three stripes is Adidas. Like, and what is a brand? A brand is an attentional focal point.
Yeah.
And so what you get is a supremacy of the brand over the product in this kind of information economy, right? Where the industrial production has become so commodified, right? Like it's indistinguishable from one place to the next. And obviously there's difficult problems to solve. I don't want to minimize how hard it is to like make a high quality shoe at scale. That's a serious thing. But it's a solved problem, right? And Amazon's a perfect example. This is the funniest thing. Amazon's the next iteration of this because it's even surpassed the brand. And here's what I mean. So the no logo version of this is you don't know where the shoe comes from. You just know the three stripes or the swoosh. The Amazon version of this is almost an inversion of this. How many products have you ordered whose name is like RJ4532I star? And the reason you ordered it is because when you search in Amazon, the attentional focus on the top of the search results, which is the thing they are monetizing, is the thing that pops up that says like, here's the best coffee percolator. You have no goddamn idea who the brand is or anything.
It's like a meta brand. Amazon has transcended mere brands.
Exactly. And it's so wild, that experience of like ordering a thing from some company you've never heard of.
Yes. And just the assumption, my background assumption is just like, whatever this is, it's probably made in the same Chinese factory as the one with the other brand name. Like, what do I care?
Oh, totally.
What I mean? Like, I have no connection at all to the roots or the physical source of those things. But make the case that, I mean, the core of the book is that attention has become the central resource of the modern economy. Make that case. Why?
Right.
And this has happened as we've watched. I mean, it's, again, wild how fast.
Yeah, so I think if you put those things together, right, that we've moved the information economy, the most valuable resource, almost as a logical matter as attention, because information consumes attention and there's more information than ever. And because we're in an era of post-material production, and as more and more of the world moves into that kind of economy, then the finite thing left, the thing that's the most important thing to get, is attention. Because it's finite and because there's competition for it, right? Because you can't just generate more of it. It's like there's only so many people who are spending so many hours awake.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? That the competition for it is fierce and the supply is not that plastic. And so you got to keep finding new places to take it. Like if you push people's bedtime down, if you could start getting 6-month-olds, wherever you can, if you can get people to watch 3 things at once, you got to keep kind of trying to find new places to mine it.
Yes, this is to me one of the more interesting and dystopian sort of facets of all this is when you start thinking, well, okay, attention is the primary commodity. It's what everybody wants. Intuitively, it's finite, like you say, like we're only awake for so long. But then you start thinking about the details, like you make a point of saying, like people have been predicting shortages of resources for capitalism for decades. And the sort of signal feature of capitalism is that it is extremely creative at finding more of those resources. And so you start thinking in concrete terms, well, how could capitalism find more attention? And you just follow that string a while and it gets dystopian real quick. The first place my mind goes, and I'm curious whether you have thought of this too, is self-driving cars. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. The first place my mind goes, and I'm curious whether you have thought of this too, is self-driving cars. What that's going to do.
That's such a good point.
What that's going to do is
we've unlocked.
Free up a giant swath of attention, right?
Oh, that's such a good point. I hadn't even thought of that.
And they're going to swarm on those things. Like pretty soon you're going to get in a car and you are going to be wrapped by advertising.
Yeah.
This is my favorite dystopian scenario because it just feels inevitable to me.
That's a great, I don't even make that point in the book. That is a very smart insight, and I totally agree. That's a place that they will unlock a whole bunch of attention that was locked up, right? Because you had to keep your eyes on the road at some level. I mean, I say in the book, when I talk about that it's more plastic than you would think, is that like when cars were first introduced, the idea that you'd be listening to the radio while doing it, it's like, now it's like, you got to be listening to something.
I know. People get their phones out at stop signs, at stoplights, you know?
Every stop sign.
Yeah, it's wild. So there's that attention. There's like less sleep. There's things where you used to do, you used to leave the house. It's just like the more you think about it, the more you think like, oh, there is a lot of attention left.
Yes.
To mine. And boy, is it ugly to think about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, it is. And I do think that you also see increasing rebellion against it.
Well, we're gonna get to that later, but I want to do a couple other points before we talk about what the rebellion might look like. So one of the, I thought, really interesting discussions in the book is this parallel you draw. So Marx has this whole theory of the commodification of labor,
Yep.
right? So you have this thing, labor, that used to be part of my life, right? It was just mine. I did it for my own purposes and I got the immediate rewards of it. It was integrated into my life. It would never have occurred to sort of a pre-agrarian, whatever human to think of that as a commodity.
Yeah.
And what capitalism did is sort of take that from you and make it into a timed, quantifiable commodity. And thus you become alienated from it. And of course, anyone who's read their Marx knows that this goes all kinds of places, very deep. Part of his theory is this alienation of modern life, of humans from their own labor. And the parallel you draw is that what's happening now is that capitalism is in the process of commodifying attention, thus producing a similar form of alienation. So just spin that out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the signature feature of alienation, and that word can mean a lot of things and can sometimes be amorphous, is a feeling that something that should be internal to us is outside of us, and that we're a stranger to some part of ourselves because of it. Mm-hmm. And with labor, it was very material. Like, again, it's not like it was awesome before capitalism. Like in feudal systems, like just the local lord owned your labor, right?
Yeah,
it's like there was no wage because they just owned you and everything you did was for them. But, if you were a shoemaker, you made a shoe, and at the end of that process where you're doing a whole bunch of different things, you have a shoe and then you sell that shoe and you're transferring the ownership of the shoe from yourself to someone else in a market exchange and they give you money. If you spend 12 hours a day stamping soles on shoes, which is a thing that right now as I speak to you, people are doing in this world, to be clear, that's a pretty alienating experience.
Yeah, no pride of ownership,
no progression, no telos,
yeah,
right?
No narrative, no continuity.
You don't start at the beginning and then have a middle and an end and then you're finishing the shoe. And Marx recognized something profound about this. He had a whole sort of material theory of it as well as a sort of psychological experience of it. And I think with attention, it's the same thing. Carl Polanyi, who's a sort of Marx-influenced economist, uses this term fictitious commodity.
Yeah.
Where he identifies that word is useful. Like, if you take rubber out of a tree and rubber is commoditized, which means standardized, every amount of it is equal to every barrel of oil is the same as every other barrel of oil. Like, that's very different when you do it to someone's labor, because that's the thing they're doing, or their attention, which is where they're putting their mind. When you extract from within us a market commodity, we feel alienation from it. And the other similarity, I think, is this. One of the paradoxes of the industrial wage revolution that Marx is putting his finger on is labor is the most important resource in some senses to make the whole thing work. If you don't have the workers, you can't have industrial capitalism. And yet each individual's labor is essentially valueless. Mm-hmm. So it's like, from your perspective, I'm in the factory 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, and I'm poor. In the aggregate, all of those man hours add up to the Industrial Revolution. And in the same way that, like, the individual amount that's paid for our attention every day is nothing. But the aggregate of it is incredibly valuable and makes fortunes and drives the entire internet.
Similarly, I think from the boss's perspective, when it comes to labor, an individual worker's idiosyncrasies or life history, right, or personality, all of those are at best sort of a distraction and kind of an impediment, right? They're complications.
They're obstacles.
What you want is a nice, smooth, standard, tradable quantity. So in a sense, like, everything that makes people human is an inconvenience to a boss who's after labor. I think it's similar with attention. Like, this is part of what platforms to me is a way of trying to make a standardized unit of attention, right? That becomes tradable, that becomes fungible.
It's funny because there's something counterintuitive there. There's an interesting deep tension here, right? Because you're right that it's trying to do the standardization, and it is on the back end, like whatever second of eyeball looking.
Time spent on site.
Right, time spent on site. But it's also sort of the opposite of the standardization in the degree of individuation of the kind of algorithmic feed, which is bespoke in a certain way, right? Like the thing they're trying to get from you is very specific to you. This part of the alienation, I think, is we sort of lost more and more aspects of shared attention.
Yeah, the loss of this feeling that you're attending to something that other people are attending to also, right?
And I think, like, honestly, like the Super Bowl is one of the last things of this. And
yeah.
I will say this. I have come to like the Super Bowl more over time simply because it is one of the last vestiges of something we all pay attention to.
Yeah, mass culture. I mean, this is why I think people are so powerfully sentimental about the 90s in a way that I think is a little bit more than just standard nostalgia. Like, there was still a mass culture in the 90s. You know what I mean? Like, there was still something about which you could meaningfully say you were counterculture, right? Like, there was something to rebel against. There was, a shared something. But now, like, if you wanted to be rebellious, nobody's trying to make you do anything. Like, you know what I mean? There's nothing to rebel against anymore. There's no culture as such anymore, really, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I think culture finds a way is one thing I will say. Like, it is interesting to me how intensely, rabidly social we are as creatures and how we find ways to create culture under all conditions,
Yeah.
But I do think that part of the experience of alienation, which is this thing that should be internal to us being extracted from us, and also the individuation and the aloneness, all those things sort of go together.
I'll quote your own book. It's hard not to conclude that there is a relationship between the rise of solitude in modern life and this process of ever more specific individuation of our attention. So in a sense, like, our attention is constantly being captured, but creating culture, I think this is an interesting point. Creating culture right now, I think about this a lot through the eyes of my kids. Like, for me, growing up in the 90s, if I wanted to create music, there was a narrative of like what music had been popular, what music was currently popular, like, and a place for me to go, like, I'll go tweak this bit. It's just like I felt like I was part of some tradition, some ongoing, some ongoing narrative. Whereas now, everything is everywhere. Everything is on the surface. So like music, my kids, they don't like, there's no distinction for my kids between Steely Dan and, Kanye. And like, it's all just music. It's all just there. It's all just there for the taking.
Right, because they could listen to it at any time. And this is the other thing about like just
everything's everywhere, everything's all the time. So like, how do you decide, on what basis do you decide this rather than this? I will make this kind of music rather than this kind of music.
This is the funny thing, and a place that I think we are kind of coming to a 360 degrees, which is gatekeeping. Like,
yeah.
And I do think that one of the things, the problem that the algorithm solves, which actually is real, is just being overwhelmed by choice.
Yeah. Well, that coupled with the loss of trust in any particular human or institution to do that for us. We're we're letting the algorithms do it,
so the machine,
instead of people.
Yeah.
And like so much follows from that. So let's pivot toward like solutions. I say this from love. Every book like yours is required by some law or other to include the solutions chapter.
I think this is one of my best of three. I just want to say, personally, I think this is my best of the three books I've read.
Well, I will say I think it's a completely unreasonable expectation to ask analysts to have solutions to the problems they identify in their back pocket. It's kind of goofy anyway, but so you sort of nod at some solutions, but I got to say, I was not filled with like, I did not come away happy or uplifted. But let me read a couple of quotes to you, if you'll indulge me quoting your book at you again.
Yeah, please.
Here's a couple that I think really get at this. We're talking about the sort of implications for culture. We're talking about the implications for personal psychology, but then there's also, I think, just the implications for public life, society, politics. So the reality of the attention age is that everywhere you look, both formal and substantive attentional regimes have collapsed. And where there is no attentional regime, no formal set of institutions to force public attention on a topic, no basic rules for who will speak When and who will listen, the need for attention becomes exclusive. It swallows debate. It swallows persuasion. It swallows discourse whole. And then a little bit later, we have a country full of megaphones, a crushing wall of sound, the swirling lights of a 24/7 casino blinking at us, all part of a system minutely engineered to take our attention away from us for profit. Under these conditions, anything resembling democratic deliberation seems not only impossible, but increasingly absurd, like trying to meditate in a strip club. And that, to me, captured something that I haven't really been able to capture yet, which is just, not only is there nothing that I can identify as sort of rational debate or exchange of views happening anymore, I don't even really know where to look where it would happen. Like, as you say, everybody and every institution and everybody who certainly is involved in the content game is under this same compulsion.
Yeah.
They need attention. That's how they make money. And to get attention, you grab it, which by definition means not sitting on one thing for a while and considering different angles of it and considering other perspectives on it. So it seems like what we have here is an equation: the nature of attention, the nature of the attention economy, that just leaves no remainder for democratic deliberation, for sort of self-intelligent self-governance. So what, like,
how do we solve it?
Yeah, I feel doomed. It feels doomed. Like, what is the way out of this?
I think you've identified, to me, that on the sort of what authors will sometimes call the last chapter problem. Like, to me, I think you've identified the hardest one to solve. So I think you're like, that's the one that feels the hardest, which is understanding this as a collective breakdown of the ability to focus, in the same way that an individual who can't focus is going to have a hard time sustaining thought or accomplishing tasks. A society that is incapable of focusing and a democracy incapable of focusing is also going to have that, writ large, at scale.
Add this to your description, which just goes to me, and this is where I bring capitalism back in, is just that capitalism is constantly trying to satisfy those those lizard brain level wants, want. And by definition, sustained contemplation requires some bits of frustration. You will know this, like any attempt to become good at anything, and that includes arguing and deliberating or playing guitar or woodworking or whatever, requires being willing to work through frustration and live with that frustration. It seems like capitalism is devoted to eliminating any type of frustration like that, thereby eliminating any possibility of sustained anything. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that's the hardest problem. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we face. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's real bad. And, even as you're describing like yourself about how I think a great example of this, I see people always sort of talking about the legacy media and like how much it sucks. And particularly people who are now like in the content creator game. And one of the ironies is, if you have your position as an independent creator, you're actually much more tied to the like financial incentives of what you do than people in traditional legacy media. Like, someone who's a reporter at the Washington Post, like their livelihood, their mortgage didn't depend on how many views they were getting. They were, they had assignments, they did stories, they got written, and you were actually fairly insulated from these attentional imperatives. Your job was, and there's all sorts of problems with that model and all kinds of, issues.
Well, it used to be the point of that institution to protect people from those attentional imperatives. That is what journalism is.
Exactly. Because as I say in the book, attention is not a moral faculty. And that really is what it all comes down to. That when you have this breakdown of attentional regimes, this war of all against all, this sort of hyper distractibility, this inability to focus, where attention swallows everything, what gets attention is not what's most important.
Or what's true.
Exactly. It's not what's most important, and it's not what's true.
As a matter of fact, truth, as you and I know, to our great chagrin,
kind of boring sometimes.
Kind of boring, kind of frustrating, kind of more complicated than you thought it was before you took a look.
Yeah, exactly. Like people going around Los Angeles secretly lighting fires for some sinister motive is actually more interesting
Yes.
than just like there were winds and they picked up embers.
I mean, Jewish space lasers, whatever
Yes,
else you might
is a
say
better
about
story.
them, are quite interesting. You're
Yes.
going to pay attention if somebody brings them up.
So I don't have a solution to that, but here's where I do actually feel genuine, not like forced, but genuine optimism. I think the feeling of claustrophobia that we're in a corridor and dissatisfaction around the specific form of attention capitalism right now is getting so ubiquitous and so intense and acute that I do think it's hitting some breaking point.
But do people, I mean, the question I have about that is, are people accurately identifying the source of the angst they feel? Do you know what I mean? Like, to solve the problem, you got to identify the real problem.
I don't know if they are yet, but I do think I have a kind of thousand flowers will bloom version of this where I think people are going to like drop out of social media increasingly. And actually, you're seeing this in the numbers, which are going down. I think that people are going to sort of hit some wall. I think that as the internet gets less pleasant to be part of, and then like they're populating it with AI bots, which is the funniest thing I've ever seen. It's so funny to look at the modern internet and be like, the problem is we got too many people.
Yeah, like what is the most denuded form of social attention that you could possibly imagine? It is a robot saying your name. And yet, it works. Like, people are falling in love with these things. People are having relationships with these things.
Know.
It takes so little to activate that.
But I do think the rebellion is percolating, and there's a bunch of different ways it'll happen. Like at an individual level, I think in, group levels, like the sort of way that the Jonathan Haidt book has taken off in schools in terms of school and phone policy, which I think it's crazy to me that some of this stuff wasn't being done before. Like, take the kids' phones so they don't have them in class. Like, obviously.
But then just to give some color to our dystopia, you get parents be like, but what about when school shootings start?
Yeah, I know.
We need to be able to text one another for the school shootings. Oh, God.
But I will say that there's been success there. To go back to a metaphor I used before, which I actually think is really useful. Well, there's two. Let me give two sort of sources of hope. One is that there are these meme accounts that exist of like recipe books from like the 70s and 80s that are like the grossest things you've ever seen.
Yeah, Jell-O salads,
processed food casseroles, right? And the reason they work is because they're kind of identifying a kind of low point dead end in the total takeover of all of American cuisine by the most like industrial corporatized slop.
Yes.
People did start to rebel against it, and a bunch of weirdos and freaks, and I say that with love, started farms and back to the land and opened natural food stores and green markets and farm-to-table dining, and basically did completely alter the trajectory of American cuisine and American food culture. And that's not to say that we still don't have a million problems with it and sky-high rates of obesity and unbelievable amounts of processed and industrial food. But there was a resistance and rebellion that created this entire alternate universe that then kind of moved into the mainstream.
Yeah, the food revolution in our lifetime has been wild. It's
incredible.
Everywhere. Every small town now has a little coffee shop, whatever.
Totally. And the other example I think that's really useful is that we already in our lifetime have seen a corporate internet defeated by an open internet once. And people forget this, but the first version of the mass internet were the walled gardens of AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy. And the reason that AOL was able to buy Time Warner is that it was the most valued media company in the world at a certain point.
Yeah.
And what happened was that model, which was completely corporate controlled and you moved around where they wanted you to go, was destroyed by the open internet, hilariously, partly because of Mark Andreessen creating a graphical user interface web browser called Netscape that then made it possible that anyone could start a blog and you could fill in the little URL box. Anyone could be on the internet and people could exchange. And that open internet genuinely defeated the corporate internet. We have now gone through a consolidation where we're back in the period of the corporate.
We won that battle and then gave it back.
Won it and lost it. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean it can't be won again. I really think that. Like, that's another thing, is that part of the rebellion you're seeing, even just something as silly as Blue Sky, which is growing at a totally astronomical rate and is not like a nonprofit.
Yeah.
It's also a corporation. but it has the values of the open internet in it. That is because people are actually seeking this out and voting with their feet a bit. And again, how does that accrete to a democratic republic and a public that's not so malformed as the one we have? That I genuinely do not know. But I do, to my core, think that we're at a kind of like nadir. We're at the like Jell-O salad period of the internet.
Yeah.
I really do think that.
It's hard for me. I mean, I didn't come into this intending to sound like a DSA guy, but, I come back to capitalism, like just if it were just the dynamics of attention playing out, like that's how I think of the old internet, is just like the quirkiest little weirdest things you could come across because they didn't need to maximize attention.
Yep.
They just needed to get a little bit. Like you could attend to things that were sort of obscurely popular among niche groups. Like that was what was so great about it. There's so much creativity and like part of what was beautiful about the early internet is you could just be like, oh, like people are so clever. There's so many different kinds of people and they are so clever. And it made me
think it made me think like I was always blown away by how smart people are.
Yeah. And how funny they are.
How funny they are, how creative they are, what their skills and talents are, the things they can make. Like I love that part of the internet. I still to this day do.
They commodified it. Like this is where I come back to capitalism. Once you commodify it, then you have to maximize it. Then you have to direct all your attention toward what gets the most, not just some, right? A little bit. What gets the most attention? And what gets the most attention is shouting, right? Like what gets the most attention is just negativity and bitterness. And so like the internet has become like so nasty. I don't know if you've been back to Twitter recently or been back to X. I mean, if you're out of it for a while and then you go back in, you're just like, my God, what would it do to you to be in this day after day? Like I used to live here. I can't believe it,
One thought I had was I was thinking about this last election and I was thinking about 3 elections. 1964, landslide for the incumbent. That's LBJ beating Goldwater. 1972, landslide for the incumbent. That's Nixon beating McGovern. 84, landslide for the incumbent. That's Reagan beating Mondale. And then you could also add 96, which is not a landslide, but Clinton basically cruises to victory in 96. Like it's never really in doubt. It's and in all 4 of those, basically they were, the people talk about change versus more of the same elections. People were just like, yeah, things are going well. Like, let's keep this going. This is going well. I just think it's impossible to produce a public right now that would feel that way. Totally impossible. Like, and that's not even I'm not making an ideological point. I'm saying the information environment we live in, the attentional environment we live in, is one of negativity. And
it cannot spread good news.
It cannot be the case that people are like, you know what? Things are going well.
Can just say Biden set out to do X and he did it. Good job, Biden. Like no one is allowed to say anything good about anybody. This is Michael Podhorzer made this point in one of his analyses last week. It's like no political party in the U.S. is capable of winning elections anymore. The other one loses, right? Yeah. Like people get more pissed off at the other one. So as a final question, before I let you go here, it seems to me like the signal malady of our modern life, from which all these others derive, is the loss of trust. And you and I know, we've talked about social trust and how important social trust is for a society to persist, to stay, much less stay healthy. And it seems like what's happened is we've lost trust in all our institutions, right? This is in all the data. We've lost trust in one institution after another. We've lost trust in any gatekeepers. So what we have in place of gatekeepers now are algorithms run on capitalist logic. And that's what we're trusting in place of gatekeepers. Like, as you say, because information is infinite and attention is finite, by definition, all human beings in that context are dependent on filters of some kind. You have to have some kind. You're trusting some filter whether you know it or not. And if you decided that the MSM is full of crap and politicians are all lying and blah, 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 you're going to trust instead some algorithm written by Silicon Valley bros. It's not like you're not trusting someone. You've just put your trust in what seems to me the worst possible place for it. So I wonder, A, like, do you think the attention dilemma is connected to the trust dilemma. And I guess my second question, which is too big to answer on any podcast, is just like, do you see any, like I can see people, like you say, finding their attentional farmers markets, as you put it, right? Their little respites. I can imagine, especially affluent people, right? Like finding shelter from this. But what I have trouble envisioning is the redevelopment of some kind of social trust, redeveloping institutions that we charge with the task of separating what's true from what's not true. You know, like science, journalism, all of it. Like, is it just an individualist, everybody on their own world from now on?
No, I think we're going to find each other again. I really do. I know that sounds like a little hippie, but I do. And I think partly that's because the non-commercial internet defeated the commercial internet once and is going to do it again, partly because I think that actually I have a view of the possibility of human cooperation that's informed by my upbringing in the left that is, even if battered and bruised, sort of undeterred, which is that I think people can collectively do amazing things. And I think that that's going to involve activism. Like there's people, it's going to have to be a thing that people mobilize for and really like view as an issue, as something they are committed to. There's this thing called the Strother School for Radical Attention. Some really interesting people coming out of there.
Don't you worry though that like young people raised in this environment, which makes it so difficult to sustain attention and which makes that feeling of ease is everywhere. That's what I think about my kids. Like, they've just never run into any kind of friction ever anywhere, but like doing anything worthwhile, making any friendship that's worthwhile, creating anything that's worth doing requires tolerating some friction. And it just seems like that's what we've designed out of lives now.
Yeah. And I think that people, I don't know where this will end up, but I do think that people are going to find their way back to it or invent some new version of it. And I also think ultimately we are going to regulate this one way or the other. It could be good or bad. I think a lot of these companies need to be broken up. I think they're too big. I think they control too much. But like, we've gone from oligarchy as a kind of metaphor we all use to like the literal version, like the genuine literal version where it's like there's half a dozen billionaires and they're close to the like personalist leader.
We went from Soros as metaphor to like a literal dude literally doing all the things that they ever said George Soros was doing.
So I think there's going to be mobilization and activism and political pressure on this. And I think people are going to do it in a million different ways, voting with their feet, as consumers, as political actors in groups with other people, as civic actors creating civic non-commercial spaces, and also as citizens working on their government. But I do think like it feels like a breaking point to me. And that's the only good news I have, because everyone feels it. Everyone feels it. They really do. Like in the same way that like when you read accounts of people walking around London in 1890 and they're like, oh my God, this is unbearable. Literally, it's like, it is soot black skies and cholera in the water and sewage everywhere. This is the most disgusting place on earth. Something must be done.
I thought your comparison of pollution to spam, or your sort of analogy, is very good. Like spam is basically the newest form of pollution, and we've not yet really developed a regime to control it.
And so I think when you go back and you think about the conditions that brought about so much that altered the trajectory of industrial capitalism, its worst excesses, I feel like the attentional capitalism we're living right now, like it feels to me a little like that person writing there about visiting London in the 1890s, where it's just like, this is a disgusting place to be. Like, how long can this go on? And I think we're there. And I think that's the first step to like creating something new.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at some point people are going to start thinking, it's cool that I'm allowed to think whatever's happening is whatever I want to happen, but it would also be cool to know what's really happening. Like I just go waiting for like a new generation to be like, you know what? Like what's really going on though? Like I'm tired of feeling like I'm getting like being on the internet is like getting a hand job in a back alley, like someone is just like giving you whatever you want. Like at the immediately, like you get nothing, you just come away feeling kind of dirty. Like I keep waiting for people to be like, I miss developing knowledge over time and developing skills over time and valuing skills and knowledge that were developed over time. And just I keep coming back to Buddhism, as you did in the book, as a sort of corrective to all this. But We could talk about this forever. Fascinating book. I appreciate you. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you somehow keeping open eyes and strong values despite the insane contexts in which you work. So thanks for coming on, and thanks for the book.
Thanks, man. I really had a great time.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.